Hello, this is Jenny from Designs with Paper. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. We're going to make some cards today, so get comfy and let's get crafty. I want to use background stamps. I have quite a few in my stash, but I haven't found myself using them often. So to start with, I want to use these two stamps that are similar but opposite patterns. They are both a quatrefoil pattern, but one is the outline and one is the design, if that makes sense. I'm also going to stamp them on watercolor paper. Because these stamps are like about 5.5 inches square, I've cut my watercolor paper to 6 by 6 inches. And I'm going to place it in my MISTI, and I am going to use the textured side as opposed to the smoother side. I'm aware that I will not get a fabulous stamp or a perfect stamp, but that's okay. I will be adding some anti-static powder here. This is a new embossing powder tool to me. It is, what is it called? Let me look here. The Rabbit Hole Designs, it's their bunny tail, or I don't know what it's called. It holds the powder in, but also has a big brush. So I'm going to try it out, see how I like it. So I will ink up this stamp with Versamark ink because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. So that is kind of one way to use background stamps, is to heat emboss them. And then I'm going to put some watercolor over the top, which is why I have used watercolor paper. So it will create kind of an emboss resist. I have this Simon Says Stamp Rose Gold embossing powder. It's one of my favorites. Rose Gold is kind of one of my favorites though, so yeah. And you can see right there that the center of the stamp did not stamp well. Part of that is, well, all of it is because I did not put enough pressure in the center of the stamp through the MISTI lid. Like I said, I'm okay with that. All right, so let's move on to stamp B. This is a Simon Says stamp. And again, I will be using the anti-static power tool on my watercolor paper, and I will ink that up with Versamark ink. Versamark ink is my preferred ink for heat embossing. I am going to attempt to make sure I get a much more defined stamp this time because it is the image, not the outline. But even then, because it is such a large image and I am using the textured side of the watercolor paper, it's not perfect. But again, no big deal. So I am going to use my heat gun to heat set these. It's kind of hard to pick up on video, especially because it's such a light color. But pretty much once it is shiny, you know it's done. It's a little bit easier to see on the more substantial pattern. I'll kind of pick that up and see if you can see that shine on the camera at all. The cool pattern. This is, like I said, the outline version of a similar pattern. And we are going to explore how watercolors will react with both patterns. So I will be taping this down to my hardboard because I am going to be using quite a bit of water and I don't want the water to curl while I am painting it. And I pulled out my Magello Mission Gold watercolors. And for this card, I'm going to use these shades of indigo and green. And I just want to have kind of gradient kind of look, an ombre kind of look. So I have wetted down my, that's a word? Wet down. I've added water to my watercolors, my paints, and I'm also going to add water to my cardstock. And I'm using like a size 8 round brush. It's, kind of a big. It might be a 6, but I think it's a size 8. And I am just adding that ink, the paint, and letting it run down with the water. And the top one is indigo. The next one is kind of like an emerald. I think it's called Verdant. I don't remember the names of the other two, but they're green and they're pretty. One's kind of olivey, one's kind of Kelly green, and I love them because green is wonderful. I will add a second layer, especially of that indigo, which seems to kind of have faded back, which that's what happens with watercolor. Watercolor paints tend to fade back once they're dried, and the embossing powder will resist the watercolor pigment. So there you can see the color has kind of gone down in between the embossed detail. So now I am going to tape down this second panel, or technically the first panel, and I'm using the same tape. I'm just putting the dry side towards the edge of the paper, and wiping it off with a rag. And this time I'm going to use some yellow, orange, red combinations. And I've added water to my watercolor paints. And then as I picked up my paintbrush, I decided to just use my spray bottle. Same amount of water, less time. And I am going to do the same thing. I will start with yellow. I'm going to try and do a little bit more of a diagonal effect so that we get a little bit more of a more organic granulation or gradation rather of the colors. And those two kind of orangey yellows seem to blend really well. In fact, they make they look quite the same next to each other. But I am going to continue to add more pigment and add more water and let it drip down. And here you can see that the pigment is much more substantial because the embossing is merely the outline. All right, so these have dried kind of, sorta. I did set them aside to dry a bit. I am using this rag. It's just an inexpensive microfiber cloth I keep in my craft room to mop up some of the pools. And I will set this aside to dry all the way before I do anything else with them. But so it's kind of an interesting difference at how they resisted. So the next size stamp I have in my set are these ones from probably Stampin' Up! Zillions of years ago that are barely the size of a card front. And I am going to stamp them in a different way. I am using Versamark ink. I am doing an emboss resist. But instead of using my MISTI, I've placed that stamp right down onto my craft mat on my desktop. And I forgot to prepare my paper. And this time I'm just using regular cardstock. I believe this is a Nina Solar White, probably an 80-pound cardstock. And I will use my hand to both hold the paper still and add pressure to get a more even, more clearly defined stamp this time. And it works really well. In fact, so well that when I picked it up and slid it, it kind of dragged the color a little bit, or the image a little bit. And this time I want to use multiple colors of embossing powder. So I have pulled out this Ranger embossing powder. One is a navy blue, one is kind of a seafoam green. And I am going to put them both on my panel. Same thing with this chevron stamp. It is nearly the same size as a card front. It's just slightly larger than a card front. I am going to prepare my cardstock and ink it up with Versamark ink. It is a more substantial, a thicker, bolder image. So I do need to be cognizant of that as I am inking it up. Make sure the whole stamp gets wet. And I'm going to do the same thing. I did place a piece of copy paper over it just to keep the ink from the edges from getting on my hands because it's clear ink and I wouldn't see it and I could make a mess. Because for real, I would. Okay, and for this one, same thing. I want to add a couple colors of embossing powder. And this one I want to go contrasting. So I'm using purple and yellow. Purple and yellow are my favorite complementary colors. I am not 100% in love with how this embossing powder went on. I tipped it the way opposite of what I was thinking. So then I've got this little doppelganger hanging down here. And it looks like a finger or something. I don't know. Just kind of weird, but I'm going to make it work. I have added the yellow, and I will add it a little bit more over the edges to make sure I get embossing powder everywhere. And then I am going to use my heat gun and set this. So I feel like probably what I should have done with this yellow and purple is dump the purple on one end and dumped it, completely off one and kept it off and then kind of blended them together in the middle. I don't know. Instead of trying to make them look more organic. I did not like how bright the background was. And so I've taken this antique linen distress oxide ink and I'm going over just the purple areas. It seemed like a cool thing to do. And then bring the Seedless Preserves Distress Oxide ink. Wow, that's a mouthful. Into the yellow area. And then I will take that same microfiber rag, excuse me, and wipe the ink off of the embossed area. And you can see there's a little image there that I didn't stamp very good. I'll have to make sure and hide that when I turn these into cards. For the next panel, I am going to ink blend over that as well, and I will be using Speckled Egg over the entire card panel. I am not going for perfection here. I just felt like the white cardstock was just a little extra, and I was not in the mood for extra that day. Probably got too much extra for my kids. And again, I will use that microfiber rag to wipe the ink off of the embossed area, and it resists the ink perfectly. So now I have 4 panels here that I need to turn into cards. So I'm going to use this really old stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. It is called Big Scripty Greetings. And I will trim down the panels and stamp out that stamp set and create 4 cards. So I have pulled out the Waffle Flower A2 layer dies, and I'm using the second to the largest die. And I will tape it down with some painter's tape that I'm really taking measures to de-stick. And I want to make sure, especially in these watercolor panels, that I'm collecting all of the gradient. Just, what's the point of it if you're not going to use all of it, I guess. And for the map one, I am going to trim that down to the same die just a little bit. I just want to make sure there was one corner that was just a little bit kind of sloppy, so I want to trim that corner off a little bit. And then for this yellow and purple one, I'm going to trim that down with the 3rd largest die. I did go 1 die smaller because that area that did not emboss will be easier to hide now. So I will pull out some Nina cardstock and the Big Scripty stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I will be using the Sending Big Hugs, Missing You Always, Happy Birthday, and You Are Awesome stamps. And I have this pre-cut Nina paper. I'm going to stamp on this Nina Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. And it's already cut down, so I'm just going to use that. I will be using my it's VersaFine VersaClair Nocturne ink because it stamps beautifully. Now, there was a little bit of a blip in the middle of that Happy Birthday, so I'm going to make sure I really pay a little extra attention to that while I am stamping it the second time. And then I will move on to the second 2 stamps. And same thing, I'll be using that same VersaFine or VersaClair Nocturne ink, whatever it is. It stamps really, really good. Seldomly, and even when I'm stamping these big stamps, do I get a less than wonderful image. Every once in a while, if the stamp is dirty usually, like if I haven't cleaned the stamp well enough when I put it away, or if I've gotten lint on it from using a baby wipe instead of my stamp chamois, then I will have issues the next time I go to stamp with it. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened with these stamps today. I had put them away after stamping them with cleaning them with just a baby wipe. And so there was some lint on them. This stamp set predates all of the big sentiments with die cuts, so I am going to just fussy cut them with some sharp scissors. The trick to fussy cutting is to turn the paper, not the scissors. I did go ahead and heat set that just a little bit with my heat gun because it was double stamped, and it is a hybrid ink. It's a pigment dye combination. So I wanted to make sure that it was nice and dry so I didn't smudge it. And I think I even still smudged it on one piece, but on the piece I cut off, so it was a no biggie. And I don't ever cut this fast in real life. This is like 16 times normal speed. Okay, so I have to figure out which stamp set I want to use to cover up that up. And I think this big Happy Birthday will be fine. So I am going to go ahead and use some liquid glue to make sure that it's adhered down well, because that embossed area does cause a raised portion of the card. I will be putting the Missing You Always sentiment on the map stamp set. I will be putting the You Are Awesome on this watercolor stamp set where I can kind of hide that less than perfect stamping, and the Sending Big Hugs on the blue-green watercolor. I will put all of these panels onto a white card base. This is a 110-pound cardstock. For some reason, white cardstocks in an 80-pound aren't quite as thick as like a colored cardstock in an 80-pound. I'm sure that has something to do with the processing. But when I want to use a white cardstock, I definitely go for the 110-pound. I think this is my Stampin' Up! 110-pound. I had just gotten my new paper order in, and that's one of the papers I ordered. It's nice and smooth, so it stamps nicely if I want to use it for that. I've also discovered that it goes through my hot foil machine, my Spellbinders Glimmer machine, really nicely. So, okay, now we're going to use the ATG gun to adhere all of these card panels to the fronts of the card, and then we're done. And in about an hour, I think the footage that I cut down was about an hour, I had 4 cards and a little bit of experimenting and just fun play. I already knew that the ink and the watercolor would resist the embossed areas, but I haven't played with background stamps in a while. So it was kind of nice to break them out and do something and make them the focal point of the card. Often when I use background stamps, they are very much the background. So it was kind of nice to have a change of pace with that. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have enjoyed it, please go ahead and give me a thumbs up. It kind of helps define the YouTube algorithm anyway. Here are my 4 cards. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel. Here's a couple of close-ups just so that you can see them in a little bit better light. Thank you so much. Have a fabulous, fabulous day. And don't forget, leave me comments. I love comments, and a thumbs up. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. I have added a video here I think you will enjoy, and a subscribe button. If you have not done so already, I would love it if you subscribe to my channel. And please share this channel with anybody who you think might appreciate it. Have a great day.